The papers were tucked between his 9-iron and wedge, folded neatly like a scorecard, but infinitely more devastating. February 15th, 2027. 3 years, 2 months, and 5 days from the moment I stood in our garage, supposedly looking for the tennis racket I'd lent him, and found instead my husband's detailed exit strategy from our marriage. My hands didn't shake. That would come later. In that moment, standing among the golf clubs and old paint cans, I felt an eerie calm descend over me. The kind of calm that comes when you finally see the tiger that's been stalking you through the jungle. "Honey, did you find it?" Richard called from inside the house, his voice carrying that particular tone of impatience he used when I was taking too long at tasks he deemed simple. "Still looking," I called back, photographing every page with my phone. The prenup clause was highlighted in yellow. In the event of divorce initiated after 5 years of marriage, the financially disadvantaged spouse shall receive 50% of all marital assets. If divorce is initiated before the 5-year mark, the financially disadvantaged spouse shall receive a one-time payment of $50,000. We'd been married for 1 year, 11 months, and 10 days. I replaced the papers exactly as I'd found them, grabbed the tennis racket from where it had fallen behind his golf bag, and walked back into the house where my husband of almost 2 years was preparing for his weekly poker night. "Found it," I said, holding up the racket. "It was behind your clubs." Richard barely glanced up from his phone. "Great. Listen, don't wait up tonight. The guys are talking about hitting the casino after poker." "Have fun," I said, kissing his cheek. He smelled like the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas, and the breath mints he chewed obsessively since quitting smoking. Normal smells. Familiar smells. The smells of a man who had already decided to leave me, but was waiting for the most financially advantageous moment to do so. I'm Charlotte Winters. Charlie to everyone except my mother and, apparently, my future ex-husband's divorce attorney. When I met Richard Prescott IV at a charity gala 4 years ago, I was a freelance graphic designer, making ends meet with creativity and caffeine. He was heir to the Prescott pharmaceutical fortune, all sharp suits and sharper smiles, the kind of man who ordered for you at restaurants and somehow made you feel grateful for it. "You're refreshing," he told me on our 3rd date. Real. Not like the gold diggers I usually meet. I'd fallen for it completely. The whirlwind romance, the surprise proposal in Paris, the fairy tale wedding that his mother had planned down to the last gardenia. When he'd presented the prenup a week before our wedding, I'd signed it without hesitation. "It's just a formality," he'd assured me. "Family lawyers insist on it. But you and I, Charlie, we're forever." Forever, as it turned out, had an expiration date of 5 years, contingent on maximizing his financial advantage. That night, while Richard lost money at the casino with his poker buddies, I sat at my computer and began my research. The divorce papers had been drawn up by Sinclair and Associates, the same firm that handled the Prescott family's business. The lawyer's name was Brandon Sinclair himself, Richard's Yale roommate and the best man at our wedding. I pulled up our wedding photos on my laptop. There was Brandon, toasting our eternal happiness with champagne that cost more than my monthly rent used to be. Had he already been calculating the optimal divorce timeline as he smiled for the camera? Over the next few weeks, I became a student of my own marriage. I noticed things I'd overlooked before. How Richard's business trips always coincided with his ex-girlfriend Melissa's Instagram posts from the same cities. How his mother, Eleanor Prescott, still set his place at family dinners with the china she'd bought for Melissa, never switching to the pattern she'd grudgingly purchased for our wedding. How his father called me Charlotte, with the same tone one might use for the help. But most importantly, I studied the prenup I'd signed so carelessly. And that's when I found it, the clause that would become my salvation. Section 7.3. This agreement shall be rendered null and void in the event of proven infidelity, fraud, or criminal activity by either party. Richard thought he was clever, planning his exit 3 years in advance. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married. I couldn't confront him. That would just push him to divorce me immediately, leaving me with $50,000 and a broken heart. Instead, I had to play the long game. I had to outplan the planner. Step 1 was financial independence. I threw myself into my design work with new vigor, taking on every client I could handle. Richard noticed my increased workload but approved. It fit his narrative of the struggling artist wife who would clearly need his financial support after their inevitable split. "Don't work too hard, darling," he'd say, patting my head like I was a particularly clever pet. "You'll strain your pretty eyes." I smiled and kept working, building a client base that included 3 Fortune 500 companies by year's end. My income tripled, then quadrupled. I opened separate bank accounts he didn't know about, perfectly legal but completely private. Every extra penny went into investments chosen with the help of a financial advisor I met at a women's entrepreneurship conference. One Richard thought was a cute hobby. Step 2 was evidence. If I was going to prove infidelity, I needed proof. I hired a private investigator, paying cash from my graphic design earnings. Monica Chin came recommended by a divorce attorney I'd consulted secretly, and she was worth every penny. Your husband isn't particularly careful, she told me after a month of surveillance. He meets Melissa Hartwell twice a week. Thursdays at the Ritz-Carlton, Sundays at her apartment. They've been doing this since before we were married? I guessed. 6 months before, actually. Would you like to see the photos? I looked at them once, these images of my husband entering hotels and apartments, kissing a woman who looked like the daughter Eleanor Prescott had always wanted. Then I locked them away in a safety deposit box Richard didn't know existed, along with copies of credit card statements showing jewelry purchases I'd never received and hotel charges for cities I'd never visited. Step 3 was patience. For 3 years, I had to pretend I didn't know my marriage had an expiration date. 3 years of dinner parties where his family treated me like a temporary inconvenience. 3 years of I love yous from a man who had already drafted my dismissal. 3 years of sharing a bed with someone who saw me as a financial liability to be minimized. Some nights were harder than others. When he'd pull me close and whisper sweet promises about our future, knowing he'd already planned its end. When he'd talk about vacation homes and children, all while counting down to his financial freedom. When he'd make love to me with a passion that felt real, even though I knew Thursday he'd share that same passion with Melissa at the Ritz. But I persevered. I built my company, Charlotte Designs, into a powerhouse firm with 12 employees and annual revenues that would have shocked the man who'd married a struggling artist. I invested wisely, guided by mentors Richard didn't know I had. I documented everything, every Thursday poker night, every Sunday golf game, every piece of evidence that would void that prenup he was counting on. And I waited. Year 2 passed. Richard grew more careless, more confident in his deception. He'd stopped hiding his phone when texts came in. He'd stopped making excuses for the perfume on his clothes. He'd stopped pretending to care about my work, openly dismissive of what he called my little design projects. Year 3 arrived like a ticking time bomb only I could hear. Richard became almost giddy as February approached. He bought a new Porsche, started working out obsessively, got his teeth whitened, preparing for his new life. On February 1st, 2027, I watched him leave for work, knowing he had an appointment with Brandon Sinclair that afternoon. The divorce papers I'd found 3 years ago would finally make their official appearance. I dressed carefully for the occasion, not in the designer clothes he'd bought me, but in a sharp business suit I'd purchased with my own money. I sat in our living room, my laptop open to Charlotte Designs' latest financial report, and waited. He came home at 6, carrying a bouquet of flowers, gilt roses, I'd learned to call them, and wearing the fake sad expression he'd practiced in the mirror that morning. I'd watched him do it while pretending to still be asleep. "Charlie, we need to talk," he began, settling into the armchair across from me like a king preparing to address a subject. "Yes," I agreed. "We do." He blinked, thrown off by my calm agreement. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our future." "You mean the future you planned 3 years ago?" I asked, pulling out my phone to show him the photographed divorce papers. February 15th, 2027? That's 2 weeks from now. Right on schedule, Richard. His face went through a spectacular range of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, a sick attempt at damage control. "Charlie, I can explain." "No need." I opened my laptop, turning it to show him a presentation I'd prepared. "Let me save you the trouble. You've been having an affair with Melissa Hartwell for 4.5 years. Every Thursday at the Ritz, every Sunday at her apartment. Sometimes Tuesdays if you're feeling particularly energetic." His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "You've spent $73,000 on her in the last 3 years alone. Jewelry, trips, that abortion she needed last spring." "Oh yes, I know about that too. Charged to the credit card you thought I didn't monitor." "How did you?" "The same way I know about the offshore accounts you've been moving money into. The same way I know about the apartment you've already leased starting March 1st. The same way I know Melissa thinks she's getting married in June. though I notice you haven't actually proposed yet. Waiting for the divorce to be final first? How prudent. I stood, smoothing my skirt, and handed him a thick envelope. These are my divorce papers. You'll notice the date is today, not 2 weeks from now. You'll also notice I'm citing infidelity, which, according to Section 7.3 of our prenup, voids the entire agreement. His face had gone from red to white to an interesting shade of gray. You can't prove. I have photos, credit card records, hotel receipts, and a particularly interesting video from the Ritz security cameras. Amazing what cooperation you get when you design their new corporate identity pro bono. He lunged for the envelope, tearing it open to read the terms. His hands shook as he reached the financial section. This is insane. You want everything? The house, the cars, alimony? And what's this about the trust? Ah yes, the Prescott Family Trust. I smiled, genuinely enjoying myself for the first time in 3 years. Turns out your grandfather was quite progressive. The trust passes to the legal spouse of any beneficiary who commits adultery, as they have shown themselves unworthy of the Prescott name. Your great-aunt Mildred added that after your grandfather's affair in 1962. Family history is fascinating, isn't it? My mother will never let this happen. Your mother will have no choice. I've already met with the trust's board of directors. They were very interested in the evidence I provided. They're particularly concerned about the emails where you discuss hiding assets from the IRS. Tax fraud is so unseemly for a pharmaceutical dynasty. Richard sank into his chair, the divorce papers crumpling in his fists. How long have you known? 3 years, 2 months, and 5 days, I said precisely. The day I found your future divorce papers in your golf bag. And you just pretended? For 3 years. The same way you pretended to love me while planning your exit strategy. The difference is I was better at it. I gathered my laptop and purse, heading for the door. I'll be at the Four Seasons. My lawyer will be in touch about moving your things out. Oh, and Richard? Melissa is in for a surprise. That apartment you leased? I bought the building last month. Her rent just went up. Significantly. Charlie, wait. We can work this out. We can. No, I said, turning back one last time. We can't. You made your choice 3 years ago. You decided I was worth exactly $50,000 and a clean exit. You just forgot one crucial thing. What's that? I'm not the struggling artist you married. I haven't been for a long time. Charlotte Designs is worth $8 million as of our last valuation. I have clients across the globe, investments you never knew about, and skills you never bothered to notice. You spent 3 years planning to leave me with nothing. I spent 3 years making sure I'd never need anything from you again. The door closed on his shocked face with a satisfying click. The divorce was finalized in record time. Richard's lawyers tried every trick in the book, but my evidence was airtight and my lawyers were better. The prenup was voided, the trust transferred according to its own bylaws, and Richard Prescott forelearned what happened when you underestimated a struggling artist. He married Melissa 8 months later in a modest ceremony that his mother refused to attend. They divorced 18 months after that when she caught him with his new secretary. Some patterns apparently never change. I kept the house but sold it within a year, using the money to buy a brownstone in the city where Charlotte Designs had its headquarters. The company went public 2 years later, making me wealthier than Richard had ever been. But the real victory wasn't the money or the vindication. It was the knowledge that when faced with the worst betrayal imaginable, I hadn't crumbled. I'd planned. I'd persevered. I'd won. Sometimes, when I'm working late in my office, I think about those divorce papers hidden in his golf bag. He thought he was so clever, planning his escape 3 years in advance. But he'd forgotten the most important rule of warfare. Never let your enemy know your timeline. Because given enough time, even a struggling artist can become an empire builder. And empires, as Richard learned too late, always outlast escape plans.